Danielle Brooks sat quietly in the back of her government car, watching the city streets roll by as they approached one of the city's public schools. She wore her simplest attire today, a modest navy sweater, a pair of comfortable jeans, and flat shoes. She'd tied her curls back into a loose bun, hoping to blend in as much as possible. After all, this wasn't an official visit. This was her personal observation, a way to understand the day-to-day life in schools like the one she had attended as a child. As the car pulled up in front of Jefferson Middle School, Danielle's driver offered to accompany her inside, but she politely declined. Today, she wanted to walk alone, without any escort or security detail. In this simple outfit, without her usual entourage, she hoped she might get an authentic look at the school's atmosphere and meet people who wouldn't think twice about her identity. She knew what assumptions people often made. She'd lived through them her whole life. When she entered the school's front office, the receptionist gave her a brief glance and then returned her attention to the computer in front of her. Danielle approached the desk and waited a moment, but the receptionist barely looked up. "Hi, I'm here to," she began, but was interrupted. "Please take a seat over there." The receptionist gestured with a dismissive wave toward a small waiting area. "Someone will be with you shortly." Danielle nodded and sat down, noticing a few other people waiting, mostly parents there for meetings. Some of them threw her curious looks, but most were occupied with their phones or paperwork. She couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. It reminded her of past experiences, where people made assumptions based on nothing more than her appearance. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression emerged from a nearby office, clipboard in hand. She barely looked at Danielle before addressing the waiting group. "Excuse me, miss," Danielle spoke up, stepping forward with a friendly smile. "I'm here to take a tour of the school." The woman frowned, giving Danielle a quick once-over. "We don't do walk-in tours," she replied, her tone sharp and dismissive. "You will need to set up an appointment with the administration if you're looking to enroll a child here. I actually wanted to see a bit more than just the front office. I'm particularly interested in the classrooms," Danielle continued, keeping her tone polite, despite the cold reception. The woman's gaze sharpened. "Why exactly are you here? Are you with the cleaning staff?" For a moment, Danielle was taken aback. She cleared her throat, steadying herself. "No, I'm just a visitor. I came here to understand a bit more about the school's day-to-day." The woman didn't respond immediately, instead exchanging a look with the receptionist, who smirked subtly. It was clear they'd size her up without a second thought. Danielle had been through these moments countless times, yet they still stung. Here she was, the Minister of Education, dismissed as if she didn't belong. After a tense silence, the woman sighed and looked back at her clipboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not sure we can accommodate you today. This isn't some open house where people can just walk around." Danielle felt her patience thin, but she kept her composure. "I understand, but if you could make an exception, I'd be very grateful. I came here today with the hope of seeing what's really happening in our schools, and this place looked like a good place to start." The woman hesitated, seemingly weighing her options before eventually nodding. "Fine, but you'll have to stay with me. We don't allow visitors to walk freely around the building." As Danielle followed her through the narrow halls, she caught glimpses of classrooms filled with bright-eyed students, some of whom glanced curiously as she passed by. She observed outdated posters on the walls, cracked tiles on the floors, and classrooms that felt worn and underfunded. There was a disheartening lack of color and vibrancy in the spaces meant to inspire young minds. Her guide led her past several rooms without pausing, only briefly mentioning the grade levels or subjects being taught. It was clear that the woman's tone hadn't warmed. She seemed determined to keep Danielle's visit brief and strictly supervised. But Danielle was here to learn, and every glance into these rooms gave her a clearer picture of what needed to change. They reached a classroom where a group of students sat hunched over their desks, scribbling in workbooks. Danielle paused, fascinated by the scene. The kids looked engaged but distracted, their attention wavering as they worked. There was an exhaustion there, a dullness in their expression she couldn't ignore. "Is there a problem?" the woman asked, eyeing Danielle with thinly veiled irritation. "No, not at all. I just wanted to get a feel for the environment. That's all." She offered a tight smile. The woman gave a curt nod, clearly impatient to wrap up the tour. As they continued down the hallway, Danielle couldn't help but feel an ache in her chest. She'd come here with the hope of seeing the challenges firsthand, but she hadn't expected to be brushed aside like this. It reminded her of how far there was to go, not only in improving the resources in schools, but in changing the mindset of those entrusted with these young lives. This visit, Danielle thought, was only the beginning. Danielle walked through the halls with her assigned guide, the woman's heels clicking sharply against the floor tiles. Danielle's steps were quieter, but her mind was anything but. Her thoughts churned as she observed the cracks in the walls, the chipped paint, and the worn-out desks peeking from classroom doors. It all reflected a lack of care, and Danielle knew this wasn't due to a lack of effort from the students or even most teachers. It was a systemic neglect, a message that the school's needs simply weren't a priority. The woman guiding her, Ms. Adams, seemed eager to end the tour, her clipped responses and hurried pace, making it clear she didn't want to spend any more time with Danielle than absolutely necessary. As they passed by a classroom with laughter spilling out through the door, Danielle paused, the sound drawing her in. "Could we take a look in here?" she asked, nodding toward the door. Ms. Adams hesitated, giving her a look of mild annoyance. "That's Mrs. Clark's class, 6th grade," she said tersely. "They're working on a group project. It might not be the best time." But Danielle just smiled politely and moved toward the door, gently pushing it open. She watched as students sat in small groups, discussing ideas, exchanging laughs, and working together. They were full of energy and enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the worn-down building they occupied. As she stepped back into the hall, a young teacher emerged from a nearby classroom, his face lighting up as he greeted Ms. Adams. He nodded toward Danielle, smiling, though his curiosity was apparent. "I'm just visiting today," Danielle said warmly, extending a hand. "I want to see how everything's going here in the school." The young teacher introduced himself as Mr. Lewis, shaking her hand. He looked over at Ms. Adams, who quickly explained, "Ms. Brooks is here for a casual visit, Mr. Lewis." The wording wasn't lost on Danielle, who gave a polite nod. But Mr. Lewis seemed pleased with her interest. "Well, it's always nice to have someone stop by. There's a lot going on here every day, and the students are incredible. They've got so much potential. It's just a matter of giving them the right tools to grow." Ms. Adams cleared her throat, clearly uninterested in prolonging the conversation. "Well, we need to keep moving. Thank you, Mr. Lewis," she said with finality. As they continued down the hall, Danielle glanced back, catching Mr. Lewis's gaze as he gave her an encouraging nod before ducking back into his classroom. Danielle felt a renewed sense of purpose. There were people here who cared deeply for these students, but they were fighting against an outdated system and limited resources. "Is there anything else you'd like to see?" Ms. Adams asked, her tone barely masking her impatience. Danielle thought about it for a moment. "Actually, I'd love to visit the cafeteria and maybe see the facilities available for extracurriculars, like the art room or gym." Ms. Adams raised an eyebrow, seemingly baffled by Danielle's interest in such areas, but she nodded. Fine. This way. They walked in silence to the cafeteria, where the smell of reheated food hung heavily in the air. Danielle noted the faded tables and chairs, many of them scratched or wobbling. Students shuffled in line, carrying trays with portions that looked far too small for growing kids. Danielle's heart ached as she imagined herself in these kids' shoes. This cafeteria was where they fueled up, where they found energy to make it through the day. Yet the food and environment seemed an afterthought. Ms. Adams led her next to a small, cramped art room. The walls were bare, the tables worn. A few students were inside, painting quietly, their brushes moving over paper that looked as though it had been used a few times before. Danielle's gaze lingered on them, seeing the focus in their eyes despite the lack of resources. The art room doesn't get much funding, I suppose? Danielle asked gently. Ms. Adams barely met her gaze. There's not much of a budget for things that aren't considered essential, she replied dismissively. We have to prioritize. Danielle nodded, understanding all too well what prioritizing usually meant in such schools. Art, music, physical activities. These were often the first things to go when budgets tightened, leaving students with little beyond basic academics. As they made their way toward the gym, Danielle thought about how hard these students must work to stay motivated. She had come from a school like this, one that had been similarly neglected, and it was only through sheer determination and the support of a few caring teachers that she made it as far as she had. When they entered the gym, it was empty, save for a few stray basketballs in one corner. The space was dull, the walls scuffed and peeling. She wondered how these students could possibly feel inspired to dream big in spaces that looked like this. This gym is only used for basic PE classes, Ms. Adams explained, sounding more and more like she was reading off a list. We don't have a dedicated instructor, so teachers take turns supervising. Danielle nodded again, absorbing the reality of it all. Each room she visited, each detail she noticed, only strengthened her resolve. If a student in a school like this managed to graduate, it was against the odds. And even for those who succeeded, how many others fell through the cracks? They returned to the front office, and Danielle could see that Ms. Adams was more than ready to see her leave. But Danielle wasn't done yet. She looked around one last time, her gaze landing on a group of young students waiting to be picked up, their faces a mix of hope and resilience. Thank you for your time, Ms. Adams, she said, a warm yet unreadable smile on her face. This has been informative. Ms. Adams barely returned her smile. Well, I hope you got what you came for. Oh, I did, Danielle replied, her voice calm but resolute. More than I expected, actually. With that, she turned and left, her mind already forming ideas for change. This visit had shown her exactly what needed to be done, and she was just getting started. As Danielle left the school, her heart was heavy, yet her resolve had never felt stronger. The morning's visit had been eye-opening in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had seen similar conditions growing up, but witnessing it now as someone in a position of influence hit differently. She couldn't stop thinking about the children, the teachers, and even the staff who, despite their attitudes, were likely worn down by years of systemic neglect. Once back in her car, Danielle pulled out her phone and began to jot down her observations. She was thorough, making sure to include everything: the peeling paint, the shortage of materials, the lack of art supplies, and even the way Ms. Adams had regarded her. Every detail felt important because, as Danielle knew, the small things often painted the clearest picture of a much larger issue. Her mind was racing with ideas, policy changes, budget reallocations, programs to bring more arts and extracurriculars into schools like this one. But she also knew that lasting change would require more than just good intentions. She would need allies' data and, most importantly, a solid plan. That evening, Danielle stayed up late at her office, surrounded by stacks of reports and budget documents. She made calls to colleagues, gathering information about school conditions across the state. She wanted to know if what she'd seen today was an isolated incident or part of a widespread problem. The responses she received only fueled her determination. One call in particular, with a fellow board member named Richard, stood out. Richard had worked in the education sector for over 20 years and was known for his honesty and dedication to fairness. He listened intently as Danielle recounted her visit, and his sigh on the other end of the line was heavy. "It's not just one school, Danielle," Richard admitted. "We've seen these issues in many districts, especially the underfunded ones. And the saddest part is that most people know about it, but either feel powerless or choose to ignore it." Danielle clenched her fist, anger and frustration building inside her. "We have to do something, Richard. These kids deserve a real chance. They deserve schools that nurture them, that make them feel seen and valued. This isn't just about money. It's about dignity and respect." Richard's voice softened. "You're right, Danielle. And if anyone can make a difference, it's you. People respect you, and they'll listen. But you'll need a plan that addresses this from the ground up." Danielle thanked him and ended the call, feeling both the weight of responsibility and a surge of hope. She spent the next few days drafting her proposal for a new initiative, tentatively titled Project Bright Future. The initiative aimed to provide equitable resources to all schools, with a focus on revamping facilities, increasing funding for extracurricular programs, and training staff on cultural sensitivity and inclusivity. The proposal came together piece by piece, as Danielle thought back to each encounter she'd had that day. She knew that change wouldn't come easy. She would likely face resistance, especially from those who saw no problem with the status quo. But she had never been one to back down. A week later, Danielle was ready to present her ideas to the Education Board. She had rehearsed her speech multiple times, making sure every word reflected the urgency of the situation. She knew this was her moment to plant the seeds of change. On the day of the presentation, Danielle arrived at the board meeting with a calm confidence. She took her seat at the table, surrounded by other officials who had seen her dedication firsthand, but weren't yet aware of the bold reforms she was about to propose. The room was filled with chatter, but Danielle remained silent, focusing on her notes until it was her turn to speak. When the chairman, Mr. Hargrove, finally called her name, Danielle stood, her gaze steady as she scanned the faces around her. She could see curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps a bit of weariness in some eyes. But she wasn't here to convince them of the need for change. She was here to make them feel it. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," Danielle began, her voice strong and clear. "I recently visited one of our public schools, posing as an everyday visitor. What I encountered was heartbreaking. I saw students trying their best in an environment that lacks even the basics, a gym with no equipment, an art room without materials, a cafeteria that feels more like an afterthought than a place for nourishment." Her words hung in air, and she could feel the tension in the room as she continued. "These children are not just numbers on a report. They're young minds with limitless potential, waiting for the chance to shine. Yet, we're failing them. We're sending a message that they're not worth investing in, and that message is wrong." She took a deep breath, letting the silence make her point before introducing Project Bright Future. She explained each part of her proposal, outlining the steps needed to fund, revamp, and support under-resourced schools. Her plan wasn't just about money. It included specific training for staff, programs to improve student well-being, and increase community involvement. The room remained silent as she finished her presentation. Mr. Hargrove, who had listened with an intense expression, finally spoke up. "Ms. Brooks, this is an ambitious proposal," he said slowly. "There's no doubt about the need for change, but I imagine there will be considerable pushback, especially around the reallocation of funds." Danielle met his gaze, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Hargrove, but this isn't a matter of convenience. It's a matter of justice. If we continue to ignore these issues, we are complicit in holding these students back." A murmur rippled through the board members, and Danielle could see some nodding in agreement. Richard, who had been quiet so far, spoke up with a smile. "I think we owe it to ourselves and to these students to consider this plan seriously. Danielle has made a compelling case, and I believe it's worth pursuing." Encouraged by his support, others began to voice their agreement. There were still some who seemed hesitant, but the majority were nodding, discussing how they could implement parts of Danielle's plan. As the meeting wrapped up, Danielle felt a rush of relief and excitement. It was only the beginning, and she knew there was still a long road ahead. But today, she had planted the first seeds. Walking out of the boardroom, Danielle felt the weight of responsibility, but she also felt hopeful. This was a journey, and she was ready to fight every step of the way for the future of those students. In the days following the board meeting, Danielle set to work rallying support for Project Bright Future. She knew that, for her plan to succeed, it couldn't just be her passion driving it. She needed to create a coalition of educators, parents, community leaders, and other stakeholders who understood what was at stake. The plan's success depended on buy-in from people at every level. To start, Danielle reached out to Marissa, a well-respected principal at a high school in one of the underfunded districts. Marissa was known not only for her dedication to her students, but also for her ability to mobilize her community around important causes. Danielle believed Marissa would make a powerful ally. When they met over coffee, Danielle didn't waste any time. She laid out her experiences, describing her visit to the school and the issues she had seen, along with the resistance she anticipated facing. Marissa listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to empathy, then to determination. "It's not news to me," Marissa said with a sigh, shaking her head. "But hearing it from someone like you, Danielle, it gives me hope. Too often, these problems go unnoticed or are brushed aside. If you're committed to this, then you can count on me to rally the community." With Marissa on board, Danielle felt the first glimmer of momentum. She knew it would take more than just one meeting, though, so she set up a series of gatherings at community centers across the city. These gatherings were designed to be informal yet impactful, creating a space for parents, teachers, and students to share their experiences and voice their needs. At the first meeting, Danielle stood at the front of a modest hall, looking out at the diverse faces before her. Parents juggling work and childcare, teachers exhausted from overburdened classrooms, and students eager to share their own stories. She was moved by their turnout and their willingness to share. A father in the back of the room raised his hand to speak. "I want my kids to have a fair shot," he said, his voice shaking. "But every day, they come home and tell me about things their school doesn't have, like computers and sports equipment. And I know other schools have those things. Why not ours?" Danielle listened, nodding, and thanked him for sharing. "You're right," she replied. "Every student should have access to those opportunities. It's not fair, and it's not right. That's why I'm here, to change that." As more parents spoke up, Danielle saw the impact of their stories. Their voices became a powerful force, each one reinforcing the need for the changes she was fighting for. She promised them that Project Bright Future would be more than just words on paper. It would be a movement that put their children's needs first. Throughout the night, Danielle gathered not just words but raw data, real accounts of the disparities that plagued their schools. She took notes on everything. Her heart breaking as parents described outdated textbooks, classrooms without air conditioning, and students who felt overlooked by a system designed to support them. But as heavy as the night's stories were, Danielle also felt something else in the room. Hope. The people here had been waiting for someone to see their struggles, to validate them, and to promise real change. By the end of the meeting, several parents had approached her, offering to volunteer their time to help however they could. Over the next few weeks, Danielle's coalition grew. Teachers, parents, and local activists began organizing, distributing flyers, and encouraging others to join the movement. Marissa's high school even held an assembly where students wrote letters and made posters expressing what they needed from their schools. The artwork and letters were a heartbreaking yet beautiful reminder of why Danielle had started this journey. One evening, Danielle received a message from a local journalist, Tony Morales, who had heard about the growing movement and wanted to interview her. Danielle was initially cautious. She knew media coverage could be a double-edged sword, but after careful consideration, she agreed, realizing that if handled right, Tony's coverage could bring much-needed attention to the project. The interview took place at Tony's office, with Danielle describing the experiences that had shaped her mission. Tony listened with rapt attention, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. At one point he asked, "What keeps you going, Ms. Brooks? I imagine this must be exhausting, especially with all the opposition you're likely facing." Danielle paused, choosing her words carefully. "Honestly, Tony, it's the children. Every time I think about giving up, I remember the kids I met, the ones trying their best despite everything stacked against them. I want to be able to look them in the eye and say, I did everything I could for you. That's what keeps me going." When the article was published, it struck a chord. Tony's writing was powerful, capturing Danielle's words and the urgency of her mission. The response was overwhelming. Emails, phone calls, and letters poured in from people across the state, sharing their own stories or offering support. Some even pledged donations, while others simply thanked her for standing up for students who had been forgotten for far too long. As the movement gained traction, Danielle began hearing from officials in other districts too. Some wanted to support her plan, while others were hesitant, citing concerns about budgets and resource allocation. Danielle knew that convincing them would require more than emotion. It would take hard data and a clear strategy. But she was prepared. Through every meeting, every late-night discussion, and every story she heard, Danielle's resolve grew. Her coalition was no longer a dream. It was real, and it was growing stronger by the day. She had the support of the community, and more people were beginning to see the potential impact of Project Bright Future. Still, she knew the battle was far from over. There were budget meetings to attend, officials to convince, and countless obstacles to overcome. But Danielle was ready to face it all, driven by the voices of the parents, teachers, and students who had trusted her to bring change. And deep down, she knew that they were just getting started. As Danielle's coalition gained momentum, she began to face resistance, not just from the usual skeptics, but from individuals and organizations that felt threatened by the changes she proposed. Many of these individuals were invested in the status quo, and Project Bright Future was a direct challenge to their comfort and control. The first signs of pushback came quietly. Several schools with well-established reputations had subtly begun to distance themselves from Danielle's initiative. Danielle received formal-sounding emails expressing concerns over the project's scope and feasibility from administrators who had once been friendly. She knew that these schools had the resources they needed, and she understood their reluctance to support changes that might redistribute funds or attention. But the pushback didn't stay quiet for long. Soon, a group of influential parents, mostly from affluent neighborhoods, began organizing against Project Bright Future. They called it unrealistic and accused Danielle of overreaching in her efforts to bring equity to the system. They argued that their children's schools should not have to sacrifice their resources for the sake of other districts. Danielle felt the sting of their words, but she also recognized this was a battle she had anticipated. Standing up for students who had been overlooked would not come without resistance, especially from those who benefited from the existing inequalities. To combat the growing opposition, Danielle reached out to her supporters, including Marissa and the network of parents and community leaders who had been vocal about their support. Together, they organized a series of community forums where Danielle could address concerns openly and speak to the values behind Project Bright Future. One evening, at a packed forum in the heart of the city, Danielle faced a room divided. Supporters of the project sat side by side with those who opposed it, and tensions ran high as people waited to hear what Danielle would say. Danielle took a deep breath, calming her nerves as she stepped to the podium. "I know that some of you are concerned about the changes we're proposing," she began, her voice steady. "But I want to make one thing very clear. This is not about taking resources away from anyone. It's about ensuring that every student in our city has access to the same quality of education. This isn't a sacrifice. It's an investment in all our futures." Her words were met with mixed reactions. A few parents nodded in agreement, but others shifted uncomfortably or exchanged skeptical glances. Danielle could see she was facing a crowd that needed more than reassurances. She continued, "When one school lacks resources, it impacts the entire community. We're all connected, and when we invest in every student, we're not just building a better future for some, we're building a stronger future for all of us." A man in the audience, clearly frustrated, raised his hand and stood up without waiting to be called on. "Why should my kid's school have to suffer because of other schools' problems?" he asked sharply. Danielle met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Your children deserve the best, no question. But so does every other child in this city. And we can't achieve that if we allow inequality to go unchallenged. Our students, all our students, are the future leaders, thinkers, and innovators of this community. Project Bright Future is about giving every one of them the tools they need to succeed." As the forum continued, Danielle answered question after question, some challenging, others supportive. But with each answer, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her vision wasn't just about equality. It was about reshaping how people thought about education and community. After the forum, Marissa approached Danielle, her expression both proud and concerned. "You handled that well, Danielle," she said, squeezing her friend's shoulder. "But they're not going to give up that easily. You're asking them to rethink everything they've taken for granted." Danielle sighed, nodding. "I know, but I believe in this project, Marissa. And I believe in these kids. If we don't fight for them, who will?" The opposition grew bolder in the weeks that followed. Anonymous articles began appearing online, criticizing Danielle's past decisions and questioning her qualifications. Flyers were distributed in affluent neighborhoods, urging parents to protect their schools from Project Bright Future. Some even accused her of pushing a political agenda rather than genuinely caring about education. Danielle was prepared for professional criticism, but the personal attack stung. Late one night, feeling particularly worn down, she sat alone in her office, scrolling through the negative messages she'd received. Doubt began to creep in, and for a moment, she wondered if she'd taken on more than she could handle. But then, as she scrolled, she stumbled upon an email from a young teacher named Michael who worked in one of the underfunded schools. His message was simple but powerful. "Thank you for standing up for us," he wrote. "Every day, I see students with so much potential who just need a chance. They're the reason I became a teacher, and it's inspiring to see someone fighting for them. Please don't give up." Reading Michael's words brought Danielle back to her purpose. She knew the path ahead would not be easy, but the stories, the hope, and the potential of the students she was fighting for outweighed any personal attacks or doubts. Project Bright Future was more than just an initiative. It was a promise she intended to keep. With renewed determination, Danielle closed her laptop and sat up, already planning her next move. She would face the challenges, the criticisms, and the fears head-on, and she wouldn't do it alone. Her coalition was strong, her mission was clear, and she was prepared to push forward. The next phase of the fight was just beginning. In the midst of the growing opposition, Danielle knew she needed to rally even more support if Project Bright Future was going to survive. She'd gained the backing of parents, teachers, and students, but to make a lasting impact, she needed the support of influential voices within the educational system and beyond. To achieve this, Danielle started reaching out to prominent educators, community leaders, and even local politicians who might share her vision. She scheduled meetings, giving presentations, and sharing her personal journey alongside the evidence she'd gathered about the disparities in the education system. She knew that for people to truly understand the urgency of Project Bright Future, they had to see the issues through her eyes, and through the eyes of the students most affected. One of the first allies she sought was Dr. Charles Hayes, a respected professor of education at a nearby university. Dr. Hayes was known for his research on equity in education and had been outspoken about his frustration with the current system. Danielle had read his articles and knew his support could lend credibility to her project. At their meeting, Danielle laid out her plans and the obstacles she'd encountered. Dr. Hayes listened intently, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back, a faint smile on his face. "Danielle," he said, "you're taking on a monumental challenge, but what you're doing is exactly what the city needs. Too many people talk about change without taking action. You're showing people what's possible." He paused, then added, "Count me in. I'll help however I can." With Dr. Hayes' support, Danielle gained access to a new platform. Dr. Hayes introduced her to other academics, local philanthropists, and education advocates, each one bringing fresh ideas and resources to the project. They helped her organize workshops and panels where she could share her vision and expand her network of supporters. Through these efforts, Danielle connected with Senator Olivia Monroe, a state senator known for her work in social justice and public policy. Senator Monroe was passionate about equity in education and had previously advocated for funding increases to under-resourced schools. When Danielle approached her about Project Bright Future, the senator was immediately interested. Senator Monroe arranged for Danielle to speak at a state education conference, where school board members, administrators, and other leaders from across the state would be in attendance. This was a huge opportunity, one that could elevate Project Bright Future from a local initiative to a model for statewide reform. As Danielle prepared for her speech, she felt the weight of the moment. She knew this was her chance to reach a broader audience, to gather support from decision-makers who had the power to implement real change. Marissa was by her side, as always, encouraging her and helping her practice. The day of the conference arrived, and Danielle took the stage with her heart pounding. She looked out at the audience, a mix of eager faces and skeptical expressions, and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice strong. "I'm here to talk about the future of our schools, our children, and our communities. I know many of you have spent your lives in education, as I have, and we've all seen the challenges our students face. But what if we didn't just acknowledge those challenges? What if we finally did something about them?" She spoke passionately, sharing stories of the students and teachers she'd met, the inequities she'd seen, and the vision she had for an inclusive, supportive educational system. She described Project Bright Future in detail, emphasizing that it wasn't just a one-time reform, but a complete rethinking of how education could be delivered. As she spoke, Danielle could see the impact her words were having. People leaned forward, nodding along, whispering to each other. By the time she finished, the room was filled with applause. Danielle felt a surge of relief and pride. She knew she'd reached people who could help her bring Project Bright Future to life on a scale she hadn't dared to imagine before. After her speech, Senator Monroe approached her, visibly moved. "Danielle, that was incredible," she said. "You've inspired so many people today, myself included. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Project Bright Future has the support it needs." With the senator's backing, Danielle gained unprecedented access to funding, resources, and legislation that would support her initiative. She was invited to speak at other events, meet with key stakeholders, and even provide input on policies that could reshape the educational landscape. Back in her city, however, the opposition hadn't disappeared. Some critics doubled down on their efforts, accusing Danielle of politicizing education or pushing an agenda that threatened established institutions. Despite these voices, Danielle's resolve grew stronger. Every new ally, every endorsement, and every step forward reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. As she returned to her office late one evening, exhausted but fulfilled, she found a stack of letters on her desk. They were handwritten notes from students and teachers across the city, each one expressing gratitude and hope. One letter, written by a young girl named Lily, stood out. "Dear Ms. Brooks," it read, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I just wanted to say thank you. My school is better because of you, and now I feel like I have a future. You make me believe that anything is possible." Danielle felt tears well up as she held the letter. Lily's words were a reminder of the lives she was impacting, the children whose futures would be brighter because of her work. With a renewed sense of purpose, Danielle knew there was no turning back. She was creating allies, building bridges, and most importantly, laying the foundation for a future where every student, regardless of their background, could thrive. Project Bright Future was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a movement. With a growing number of allies, increased visibility, and an unstoppable resolve, Danielle felt the momentum of Project Bright Future carrying her forward. Yet, as her initiative gained prominence, so did the intensity of the resistance against it. Her opponents were determined, launching public campaigns, and using the media to twist her words and misrepresent her intentions. Danielle knew she'd have to stay strong and focused if she wanted to see her vision come to life. One afternoon, Danielle received a call from Senator Monroe with unexpected news. "Danielle," the senator said, her voice tense, "we're facing a new level of pushback. A group of officials is proposing legislation that could severely limit the reach of Project Bright Future. They're saying it's too radical." The news hit Danielle hard, but she quickly rallied herself. "What can we do, Senator?" she asked, determined. "We can't let them undo everything we've worked for." Senator Monroe suggested organizing a public forum where Danielle could address the community directly, giving her the chance to clarify her vision and counter the misinformation. The senator offered to moderate the event, and together they worked to plan an evening where parents, students, teachers, and other community members could gather to hear Danielle's story firsthand. The night of the forum arrived, and the auditorium was filled with a mix of supporters, skeptics, and a significant media presence. Danielle took the stage. Feeling the weight of each stare, every camera lens focused on her. She knew that tonight was about more than defending her project. It was about standing up for the values she believed in. "Good evening," she began, steadying herself as she looked out over the crowd. "I know there are a lot of questions and concerns about Project Bright Future, and I'm here to answer them. But before I do, I want to share a little about why this project matters to me, and why I believe it matters to all of us." Danielle spoke from the heart, recounting her own experiences and the moments that had shaped her. She talked about the students she'd met, the struggles she'd seen, and the potential she believed every child had, regardless of their background. She explained in clear terms how Project Bright Future wasn't about politics or divisive agendas. It was about creating opportunities, building equity, and nurturing the next generation. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. People listened intently, some nodding along, others whispering to each other. When Danielle finished, she invited questions from the audience, ready to address any concerns. A teacher stood up, her voice wavering with emotion. "I've seen the changes in my school since Project Bright Future started. For the first time, my students feel like they matter. Thank you for giving them that." A parent followed, sharing how their child had come home excited about school again, dreaming of college and a future that once seemed out of reach. But not all comments were supportive. One man stood up and accused Danielle of pushing an agenda that threatened traditional values. Danielle listened calmly, responding thoughtfully, explaining how Project Bright Future wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a fairer future. By the end of the night, Danielle's message had reached everyone in the room. Some critics remained unconvinced, but the majority left with a clearer understanding of her vision. The media coverage the following day was largely positive, and even some of her harshest opponents admitted that she'd made compelling points. The forum had been a success, but Danielle knew the fight wasn't over. The proposed legislation still loomed, and she had to ensure Project Bright Future continued to gain support. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy, spending long hours meeting with community members, attending school events, and rallying teachers and parents to stand up for the changes they wanted to see. In the following weeks, Danielle watched as the support for Project Bright Future continued to grow. Senator Monroe worked tirelessly to advocate for the initiative, using her influence to sway key votes and gather endorsements. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes organized a coalition of educators who signed a public letter in support of the project, which was published in a major newspaper. Finally, the day of the legislative vote arrived. Danielle, Senator Monroe, and a small group of supporters gathered in the state capitol to await the results. Tension filled the room as each name was called. Each vote counted. Danielle's heart raced as she listened, feeling the weight of every yes and no. After what felt like an eternity, the final tally was announced. Project Bright Future had survived the vote, narrowly securing the support it needed to continue. Danielle felt a surge of relief and joy, and she was met with applause and congratulations from those around her. But beyond the sense of victory, Danielle felt a profound gratitude. She had faced countless obstacles and endured public scrutiny, but she had also seen the strength of her community and the power of a shared vision. Project Bright Future had come this far, and now, with the legislative backing, it had the foundation to create lasting change. As she left the Capitol building, Danielle looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of her journey. She knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. Project Bright Future was no longer just a plan or an idea. It was a movement with real momentum, a testament to resilience, and a symbol of hope for every child who deserved a fair chance at success. The victory in the legislature was just the beginning for Danielle and Project Bright Future. With the newly secured support, she and her team wasted no time in implementing changes across the school district. The atmosphere was charged with optimism as parents, teachers, and students worked together, driven by a shared goal of creating a more equitable educational environment. Danielle organized a series of workshops and community forums, allowing families to engage with the project directly. They discussed what reforms were needed most urgently, everything from curriculum changes to funding allocations for under-resourced schools. The conversations were candid, with community members voicing their concerns, hopes, and dreams for the future of their children's education. In one particularly moving session, a group of parents shared their personal stories. One mother, Rosa, spoke about the struggles her daughter faced in a school that often overlooked her needs. "I just want my child to feel like she belongs, like she matters," Rosa said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Danielle, for making us feel heard." Danielle listened intently, feeling the weight of each story. It was moments like these that reinforced her belief in the importance of Project Bright Future. She realized that the initiative was not just about implementing policies. It was about fostering a community that truly valued every child. As the months passed, Danielle saw tangible changes taking place. New resources were allocated to schools, more teachers were hired, and programs that emphasized cultural competency and inclusivity were introduced. Schools that once struggled were now thriving, and students were excited about learning. Reports of improved test scores and increased engagement flooded in, proof that the efforts were making a real difference. However, the journey was not without challenges. Danielle still faced criticism from some who felt that the changes were too radical or unwarranted. They rallied against her in meetings, organizing protests that made headlines. But each time, she was reminded of the community that stood behind her, the parents, teachers, and students who believed in her vision. One evening, after a long day filled with meetings and phone calls, Danielle found herself reflecting on her journey. She remembered the doubts she'd faced, the moments of despair, and the people who had tried to tear her down. Yet, in the face of adversity, she had found strength in herself and her community. As she scrolled through her phone, looking at photos from recent school events, students showcasing their projects, teachers celebrating achievements, and parents smiling proudly, she felt a wave of hope wash over her. This was what it was all about, creating a brighter future for the children. In the midst of this growth, a significant event was coming up, the first annual Project Bright Future Gala, aimed at raising funds to support ongoing initiatives. Danielle worked tirelessly alongside her team to organize the event, knowing it could serve as a major catalyst for further improvements in the educational system. The night of the gala arrived, and the venue sparkled with lights, laughter, and hope. Local business leaders, educators, parents, and students filled the room, all there to support the cause. Danielle stood at the entrance, welcoming guests and feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. When it was her turn to speak, Danielle took the stage, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady. "What we're building together is more than just a project. It's a movement that aims to ensure every child in our community has access to the education they deserve." As she spoke, she shared stories of students who had thrived because of the changes they were implementing. She emphasized that their success was a testament to the community's commitment to equity and justice in education. The crowd listened, captivated by her passion and determination. Tonight, we're not just celebrating what we've achieved. We're laying the groundwork for an even brighter future," she continued, her voice rising with emotion. "Together, we can create a system that not only values our children's potential, but also nurtures it, ensuring that every child feels seen, heard, and empowered." The audience erupted into applause, and Danielle felt a surge of energy that reinforced her resolve. The gala was a tremendous success, raising significant funds to support Project Bright Future's ongoing efforts. That night, Danielle received numerous offers of support from local businesses and organizations eager to partner with her. As the evening came to a close, Danielle stood outside, taking a moment to breathe in the cool night air. She looked around at the people leaving with smiles on their faces, conversations buzzing with excitement about the future. In that moment, she realized that her dream was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her. The journey ahead would still be filled with challenges, but Danielle felt more equipped than ever to face them. She had forged connections, built alliances, and most importantly, inspired a community to rise up for the change they wanted to see. With a renewed sense of purpose, Danielle smiled as she thought about the work still to come. Project Bright Future was not just an initiative. It was a beacon of hope, a promise that education could and would change lives. And she was ready to continue leading the charge. As she walked back inside, Danielle felt the weight of her role as a leader, an advocate, and a mentor. She was determined to keep fighting for those who felt voiceless, ensuring that no child would ever have to feel as she once did, alone in a world that seemed to overlook their potential. The future was bright, and together, they would ensure it remained that way.